Outsystems is the #1 platform to deliver mobile apps, portals, and web applications.
Good morning, team. A warm welcome to our entity sessions. What is an entity? An entity is an element that allows you to store the data in permanent nature and allow you to access that information or data whenever you need through the Outsystems application. Default values. So in an entity you have attributes, and every attribute will have a certain data type or can have a certain data type in which you need to store the data. And while you are storing the data, you can either enter the data, capture the data that the end user has entered into your form, or alternatively you can set up the default values for each field, and those default values will automatically get inserted into your backend database. What is an action? This is a very important aspect. So in this, using the action is where you write all your logic in the action flow. So there are different types of action flows that you can write. One is the client side or at the server side. If you see the picture on the right side, you have the start node and the end node, and in between this start node and end node, you have certain conditions, assignments, etc., which means a particular logic is being implemented in between the start node and end node, which is called the action flow. So the important aspect of Outsystems is your ability to reuse the code. So the code, as I told you earlier, it is being written in different action flows, be it in the client action or screen action or in the server actions. So that you write the code modularly or in smaller bits and pieces, you write as small as possible, and then you kind of consume across the action flows so that you have the ability to reuse as much as possible of time. So the variables, there are three types of variables. One is the local variable where you use it to store the data. The other one is the input parameter and the output parameter. So to the input parameter, you get the data coming inside, and in the output parameter, you pass the data to the next action flow. Outsystems supports multiple types of data types. You have basic data types, compound data types, lists, and structures. So which kind of helps you to define or hold the data in multiple forms in a transient manner. Exceptions is another important aspect. So any flow, in any action flow, or when a particular sequence of steps is being executed, there are two ways you can look at it. One is the normal flow, and alternatively, when the normal flow is getting executed, there will be some exception that happens. It could be a data related exception or logic related exception, or it could be memory leakage or whatever. In such scenarios, these exceptions need to be captured. So the aggregate is the visual element that allows you to define a query to fetch data from entities with many aspects like sources, filters, and you can also sort the data. So typically what happens, there is a form in which the user is entering the data, and this data needs to be captured inside the database in a permanent nature. So from capturing the data in the form to storing the data in the database, in between we do something, which is what we saw in the earlier chapter, where we wrote a lot of logic in the action. So the data is in the backend. That backend data you have got into the aggregate, and that data you need to show in the screen where the users will be able to see, which is your interface. So this, for which you are using the aggregate to fetch the data from the database, and not only from database, you can also fetch the data from other sources, and you have to the fetched data you have to display it on the screen, for which you use the widgets. Data actions. If you see on the left hand side, you have the aggregate, okay, which is the visual element. On the right hand side, you see the data action. Action is what? Is the logical or the action flow. So in this data action flow, you are writing the custom logic where you are retrieving the data, and retrieved data is put into the aggregate, which is again used to display it on the screens. Okay, data and retrieved data is put into the aggregate, which is again used to display it on the screens. In Outsystem provides an automatic validation capability, meaning the form field, you can declare it as a mandatory field, and also you can define what is the data type in which the input value should comply. Okay, so these two kind of make sure that the data is entered fully, and then it is entered in the right data type. Apart from built-in validations, you can also have your own logical validations that you can define, and this logical validations is called as custom validations, meaning you can write your own validation, and you can validate, like for example, when a employee's age is being entered or date of birth is being entered, you can kind of make sure that the age is after the current day, so something of that sort. So such kind of validations you can keep. We call it as the custom validations. Blocks are very, very important aspect, from an Outsystem perspective, and it is a little bit difficult to learn as well. And through blocks you will be able to implement the reusability aspect to the maximum extent possible. So from a UI perspective, so like the way you design your screen, you design the blocks as well. And blocks do have their own scope, similar to how a screen has its own scope. And the block will has input parameters and it has local variables where you can define it, and you can write screen actions into it. And the events are there. When the events get triggered, accordingly the blocks gets executed. So this is an important aspect. We'll dwell much deeper into this in the next session.